I first saw the photograph on an overcast Thursday in late March, the kind of afternoon when the light in the archives turns the air a dull copper grey. The university's special collections reading room always smelled faintly of paper glue and coal dust, and that day was no different. I was cataloguing estate donations from a recently closed solicitor's office in Derbyshire when I opened a cardboard folder labelled simply Private Family Photos, 1915 to 1919. Inside was a single mounted print, its edges buckled with age. The caption penciled beneath read, Harrogate Family, August 1915. At first glance, it could have been any Edwardian portrait. A father in a waistcoat and chain, a mother seated elegantly with lace gloves folded in her lap, and two adolescent daughters in identical dresses of pale muslin. A thin boy stood between them, one hand resting on his mother's shoulder. Behind the family, through the open rear door of their brick home, a rectangle of darkness cut into the otherwise pleasant domestic scene. I almost missed it, the faint pallor inside that darkness. Only when I adjusted the reading lamp did it show, a shape just beyond the threshold, the pale curve of something round, almost luminous. Not a reflection, not a trick of varnish. The outline resembled a skull. I leaned closer until my nose nearly touched the glass. The features weren't fully defined, hollows where eyes might have been, a suggestion of teeth gleaming where light should not have reached. Whoever or whatever it was, it seemed to be looking out. I remember whispering, "Good God!" under my breath. The photograph, according to the estate log, had been found among the effects of Professor Alfred G. Harrogate, a physician-turned-lecturer who vanished in 1916 during field service with the Royal Army Medical Corps. The image had likely been taken just before he sailed for France. I should have logged it, filed it, and moved on. But curiosity is the archivist's first sin. I carried the photograph to the scanning station, lowered the lid, and let the blue light crawl across its surface. When the image appeared on my monitor, the skull-like shape behind the door seemed clearer. The texture of bone was unmistakable, smooth above, fractured below. And there was depth to it, as if whatever lingered in that doorway was not printed onto the paper, but pressing forward from behind it. The reading room's overhead light flickered once, briefly, and steadied again. I found the Harrogate file in the university archives 2 days later. Alfred G. Harrogate, M.D., Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, married to Eliza Harrogate, née Venn. 3 children, Clara, Beatrice, and Samuel. The file was thin, an obituary clipping, a few letters from the War Office, and a short university notice expressing profound regret at the presumed death of our colleague. No burial certificate, no known grave. But there was also an envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand to whoever keeps his picture. Inside lay a single sheet of brittle writing paper, dated February 1916. The ink had feathered but was still legible. If you have found the likeness, keep it sealed. She comes through light now. The doorway was never a doorway. It is the gap she left when the flesh was taken. E.H. Eliza Harrogate. The note chilled me more than I care to admit. She comes through light now. What did that mean? I spent the rest of the afternoon in the county archives reading through parish ledgers. The Harrogate name appeared in baptismal registers going back to the 1850s, but the last entry stopped abruptly in 1915, when Samuel Harrogate was christened at age 10, the same year as the photograph. There was a penciled marginal note beside his name. Child died before confirmation. No date, no cause. I sat back and stared at the words until the letters blurred. The child in the photograph had been alive when it was taken, had stood between his mother and sisters, blinking dutifully in the flash. If the ledger was correct, he must have died almost immediately afterward. Yet the photograph showed 5 figures, not 4, and the skull shape in the doorway made 5 plus 1. The photographer's imprint at the bottom corner read, Leary and Son, King Street, Nottingham. I found a reference to the studio in an 1890 trade directory. The building was long gone, replaced by a shopfront, but city records listed an heir, Thomas Leary, age 93, living in a care home in Beeston. When I telephoned the facility and explained that I was researching early photographic methods, the attendant laughed. "He'll talk your ear off about ghosts in plates if you let him." I visited the next morning. Leary was frail but lucid, his eyes bright with that peculiar gleam of men who have lived too long with their own memories. When I mentioned the Harrogate name, his smile faltered. "That job," he said slowly, "nearly put my father out of business." He told me the Harrogates had insisted on being photographed at home. Mrs. Harrogate was nervous of strangers, and the doctor had recently converted part of their parlour into a laboratory for his medical research. Leary's father set up the camera by the window to catch natural light. They took 3 exposures. The first 2 plates failed. The emulsion refused to fix. On the third, the flashbulb burst too bright, bleaching the edges. "When father developed it," the old man whispered, "he saw something by the back door. Thought it was smoke at first. Then he saw the shape in the smoke." He leaned forward. He said it looked like a skull with eyes open. My hands felt suddenly cold. "Did he show them the picture?" Leary nodded. "The doctor said it was a chemical smear. But his wife, she fainted. Wouldn't let him burn it. Said it was the child's nurse who died that week. Fever. The woman was buried 2 days before the sitting. A nurse. That explained nothing and everything at once." Before I left, Leary gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "If you still have that photo, miss, don't keep it near mirrors." That's where she starts to look out. Back at the university, I requested permission to unmount the print. The conservator protested. Removing photographs from their original backing risks irreparable damage, but I needed to see the negative. When we finally eased the paper from its mount, a thin glass plate slid free, stuck with old adhesive. I held it to the lamp. The emulsion shimmered faintly, dark where the photo was light, and there, perfectly sharp, was the skull. Except on the negative, it looked less like bone and more like a face in motion, a human face distorted by movement, the eyes blank from overexposure. A woman's face. I turned the plate over. Etched faintly along the margin was a sentence, carved by hand. "She would not stay buried." I dropped the plate. It hit the table, but miraculously did not break. That night, I dreamt of a woman standing in a doorway, her face blurred by bright white light. When she opened her mouth to speak, only dust poured out. 2 weeks later, a brown parcel arrived from the Derbyshire Historical Society. Inside were 6 letters written by Alfred Harrogate to a colleague between 1914 and 1915, recently discovered in a church trunk. They were clinical in tone until the last one, dated August 30th, 1915. The experiment succeeded insofar as the medium retained the image after death. She appears still to answer in the darkroom when the plates are warmed. Eliza says she hears her breathing behind the door. I think the vessel holds. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Retained the image after death. The phrasing echoed early spiritualist language, experiments with spirit photography, where the recently deceased were believed to impress their likeness on light-sensitive plates. But Harrogate had been a physician, not a mystic, unless he was both. That evening I scanned the photograph again at higher resolution. The skull figure seemed sharper each time I enlarged it, as though gaining detail through attention. Now I could see strands of hair, the curve of a cheekbone, something like a throat beneath. And worse, the boy, Samuel Harrogate, appeared to be looking directly toward it. I drove to Rosefield House on the first clear weekend in April. The estate had long since been sold to a trust that used it for seasonal events. The caretaker, Mr. Lowe, met me at the gate, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're the researcher from the university," he said. "You'll find the place mostly sound, except for the east wing. That's where the fire was." Fire. I followed him through the corridors. The house smelled of polish and old damp. Wallpaper sagged in corners like tired skin. In the parlor, the very room from the photograph, the layout matched almost exactly. Even the carved chair remained, its upholstery replaced, but the shape unmistakable. And there, to the right, was the rear door. The wood around the frame was lighter, newer, but the proportions were identical. When I opened it, cold air drifted in, smelling faintly of earth and mildew. The garden beyond had gone to seed. I lifted my camera and took a shot for documentation. The flash popped. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to ripple. Behind me, a picture frame clattered from the wall. Mr. Lowe hurried back at the sound. "Loose nails," he said quickly, though I noticed his eyes dart to the doorway. "Best not stand there too long. Locals say that's where she looks in." "Who?" I asked. He frowned. "The nurse. Didn't you know? Died of fever before they took that photo. But some say she never left the house. You can smell the sickness when the fog rolls in." He turned away, muttering about supper. I stayed until sunset, taking more photographs. Each exposure left me uneasy, as though the air between clicks thickened. When I packed up to leave, I glanced once more toward the back door. In the dimness, the brass handle caught the dying light, two tiny circles reflecting like eyes. That night in my hotel room, I transferred the new photos to my laptop. In the first few, the room appeared as expected. But in the final frame, taken just before I left, something shifted. Near the doorframe, faint but definite, a blur shaped like a head leaned forward from shadow. I enlarged it. The blur resolved into the same skull-like visage from the 1915 photograph, only sharper now, cheeks sunken, mouth parted as if gasping. And directly in front of it, in profile, was me. The reflection of my own face in the glass of the door, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, caught mid-breath. Only the reflection's mouth was smiling. I shut the laptop. Sleep came fitful and thin. Every time I drifted off, I dreamt of the photograph again. The family frozen in their quiet pride, the skull watching from the doorway. But in the dream, the father's hand moved, tightening on his son's shoulder, and the child began to cry soundlessly, his face blurring to nothing. When I woke at dawn, the curtains were swaying, though the window was sealed. Back at the university, I sent the new images to our digital lab. The technician, a young man named Karim, called me the next morning. "You'll want to see this," he said. On his monitor, the 1915 photograph and my modern photo were overlaid for alignment. The doorways matched perfectly, but within both frames, hidden in the pattern of light, was a secondary outline, an oblong shape near the threshold, consistent across a century. Karim had run a frequency analysis on pixel brightness. "There's rhythmic variation," he explained, pointing at the waveform, "like vibration. Almost pulse-like." The word pulse made me shiver. He grinned nervously. "Maybe a coincidence. Or maybe your photos haunted Dr. Reeves." I didn't laugh. That evening, as I locked the photograph back in its case, I heard a faint tap from the glass. 1, 2, 3. When I looked, nothing moved, but the air smelled faintly of smoke and something else, sweet, like rot behind walls. 2 weeks later, the university received another donation, a small leather notebook from a private collector. Inside, in a woman's hand, was a single dated entry, April 2nd, 1915. "Alfred says the nurse is gone, but I hear her still in the hall at night. The baby coughs when she passes. I think she envies the living. The doctor says the photograph will bind her. I fear it will free her instead. Signed E.H. I set the diary beside the photograph. The initials matched Eliza Harrowgate's letter. My pulse thudded in my ears. Bind her. I realized then what I had been circling for weeks. The photograph wasn't a memorial. It was a containment, a relic of an experiment to trap the dying woman's presence in light. And if Leary's warning held true, if attention fed whatever lingered, then by scanning, enlarging, and exposing it again, I had been loosening the lock. It began with reflections. Late one evening, I was working in the darkroom, developing a batch of negatives. The sink water trembled, though no one walked nearby. When I looked down, the surface reflected not the ceiling lights, but the shape of a doorway behind me. A human outline stood there. I spun around. The room was empty. Then, faintly, a whisper. Not words, but the long exhale of someone standing too close. The lights flickered. When they steadied, droplets of water had appeared on the photograph drying line, 5 perfect circles, like fingertips. That was the night I stopped working alone after dark. But it was already too late. For several nights after the darkroom incident, I dreamed of a light bulb exploding in slow motion. Every time the glass burst, something pale and faceless stepped through. When I woke, I could still hear the click of the shutter. I tried to tell myself I was overtired. Too many late hours among the dead. Archivists learn early that history bleeds through. You read enough grief in handwriting, you begin to echo it. Still, I started keeping the photograph locked in the temperature vault, 3 corridors from my office. But the smell followed me. That faint sweetness, like rotting fruit under dust. The next clue came by accident. I was in the county registry office looking for property transfers when the clerk handed me a crumbling birth and death ledger from 1915. Between Harper Thomas and Harris Lillian sat a brief entry. Mary Latham, age 26. Occupation, nursemaid. Cause of death, influenza, Rosefield House. Influenza, 1915. The same spring the Harrowgates posed for their family portrait. I turned the page and froze. A second entry followed less than a week later. Samuel Harrowgate, age 10. Cause of death, respiratory failure. 2 deaths, 1 household. And the next line, scribbled faintly in red pencil, chilled me. Body of nurse interred on estate by permission of Dr. Harrowgate. Interred on the estate. She'd been buried there. I went back. I told no one at the university. They already thought me eccentric. The caretaker, Mr. Lowe, seemed unsurprised when I appeared at the gate again. "You'll not stay past dusk," he warned. "The place breathes wrong at night." I promised him I wouldn't. The garden behind the house had gone to seed, but I carried the register page with me and found a small mound near the tool shed where the ground sank unevenly. Someone had placed a flat stone there once, now half buried in moss. I brushed it clean. No inscription, only the letter M. When I straightened, the air turned colder. A faint whisper of fabric. That same sound the photographer had described. The movement of a heavy curtain. I turned toward the house. The back door hung slightly ajar. Inside, dust lay thick enough to dull my footsteps. The parlor felt smaller than before. The carved chair still faced the camera's spot, as if waiting. I unpacked my tripod and, against better judgment, positioned it exactly where Leary's father had stood. Just once, I told myself. A comparison shot for research. The flash fired. For a moment afterward, the world went completely silent, the way it does in deep snow. Then a single click echoed behind me, like the turning of a doorknob. When I looked, the door had closed. I developed the new image that same night in my hotel bathroom. When the picture bled up from the chemicals, my pulse spiked. In my version of the room, the light looked wrong, too flat, as if absorbed. And there, in the mirror glass of a cabinet behind the chair, stood a blurred reflection that hadn't been present when I took the shot. It was shaped like a woman in a nurse's uniform, her head tilted, her face entirely gone. The film slipped from my hands into the sink. I left the hotel before dawn and drove straight back to Nottingham. When I arrived at the university, a parcel waited on my desk with no return address. Inside was a small spool of magnetic tape and a note in neat typewriter font. For Dr. Reeves, playback at 7 IPs, found with the Harrogate file. Our department hadn't used open reel recorders in years, but the anthropology lab still had one. I threaded the tape through and pressed play. Static filled the room, long, slow bursts. Then a woman's voice, weak but clear. He promised the light would hold her. A pause. But she sees through every glass. Then, faintly, a child crying. The reel spun on blank hiss for another minute before ending. The label on the hub read, Recording 2-8, April 1916. If genuine, that meant someone had used Harrogate's voice-preserving machine after his disappearance, and someone had mailed the evidence to me. That evening, I locked my office, drew the blinds, and laid both photographs side by side, the 1915 print and the one I'd taken in the ruined parlor. Under lamplight, the similarities aligned perfectly. But in mine, the skull shape at the doorway had shifted forward, its proportions subtly changed. It was less a skull now than a half-formed face, the bones filled with suggestion of flesh. As I stared, a ripple passed through the glass. Not reflection, movement. The overhead light dimmed. My own image stared back at me from the window. Behind my shoulder, in the reflection, stood a tall figure, head inclined toward mine. I turned. No one. But the smell returned, smoke and sickness, and for the first time I heard it distinctly, a breath, long and drawn out, right behind my ear. I ran from the room. Sleep abandoned me. I filled page after page with frantic notes, trying to impose order. Mary Latham, nursemaid, died April 1915, influenza. Samuel Harrogate died 6 days later. Eliza wrote that Alfred planned a photograph to bind the nurse. The skull in the photo occupies the same doorway where Mary was buried just outside the wall. Every reproduction, digital or film, increases definition of the figure. A pattern emerged. Every act of preservation gave the image more life. Harrogate had attempted containment by light. I was undoing it. Mr. Lowe telephoned me a week later. "Miss, you'd best collect what you left," he said. "That camera of yours. It's making noises." When I returned, he met me at the gate, grey-faced. "It's the damnedest thing," he muttered. "The flash keeps going off on its own." Whole room lights up, though it's not plugged in. Inside the parlor, my tripod still stood. The bulb housing glowed faintly, a low orange pulse like a heartbeat. "See?" he whispered. I stepped closer. The glass of the viewfinder reflected not the room, but a darkened corridor leading away from it, one that didn't exist. At its far end, something moved, a shimmer of white fabric. I reached for the camera. The pulse quickened. Then, unmistakably, a voice. "Don't close the door." The bulb burst. The next morning's paper carried a brief article. Fire damages derelict estate. Rosefield house had burned again in the night. The caretaker was unharmed. He'd smelled smoke, fled, and watched as the east wing collapsed. Investigators blamed faulty wiring, though the property had none. I didn't tell them I'd been there hours earlier. The university suspended my field access for safety. I couldn't blame them, but the photograph remained in my possession. I refused to let anyone else touch it. At home, I sealed it in a metal cabinet and swore not to look again. For 3 days I managed. Then curiosity, or something whispering beneath curiosity, made me open the latch. The print had changed. The Harrogate family still posed stiffly, but the mother's eyes were now turned toward the door, wide with something like terror, and the skull figure behind the threshold was gone. That night, I woke to a noise at my flat's front door. 3 slow knocks. Through the peephole, the hallway was empty, but a faint smear of ash darkened the wood where a hand might have rested. When I turned back toward the living room, every mirror surface in the flat had fogged from inside. In the largest, the one above the mantel, 5 shapes appeared through the condensation. A man, a woman, 2 girls, and a smaller figure between them. Their faces were blurred except for the smallest, which was nothing but a skull. In the following weeks, I devoted myself entirely to reconstructing Alfred Harrogate's research. His surviving notes, preserved in the Royal Medical Society archives, described photochemical transference, a theory that light could retain traces of the human nervous system at death, energy fixed in emulsion like sound in wax. He had used a dying subject, Mary Latham, and recorded her final moments on both plate and magnetic wire, attempting to preserve consciousness. He succeeded. Eliza's diary, the letter, and the photograph were all pieces of the same attempt to contain the result. But Alfred's vessel hadn't held. It had leaked. And now, by reviving the image through digital exposure, I had reopened the wound. On the anniversary of the photograph, August 10th, I performed one last test. I placed the print under controlled light in the darkroom, set a high-resolution camera on continuous capture, and left the room sealed for an hour. When I returned, the camera's memory card was full, 3,600 images. The first 1,000 were normal. Then, frame by frame, the doorway brightened. In the 2,147th frame, a shape emerged, a woman in a nurse's cap, eyes hollow, standing half inside the threshold. In the 2,148th, her hand pressed against the glass. By the 2,149th, she had stepped forward. In the final frame, the camera faced blackness, as if something had covered the lens from inches away. I shut everything down. The next morning, the university called. The archive basement had flooded overnight. No storm, no burst pipe, water rising from the floor itself, ruining the temperature vault. When I arrived, the air smelled of mildew and decay. My sealed cabinet stood half submerged. The photograph floated face up inside, its surface perfectly dry. In the image, the family was gone. Only the doorway remained, open onto darkness. And deep within that darkness, something gleamed. The curved reflection of the lens I'd used the night before. My lens. I left the university soon after. The department called it extended leave. I called it surrender. The nightmares eased once I moved north, though I still catch the smell of smoke when the weather changes. I keep no mirrors now, only one window, high and narrow. Yet sometimes, at dusk, the glass trembles, as if someone has placed a hand against the other side. I never see the face fully, only the pale suggestion of bone, watching. But I'm alive. That, I remind myself, is more than can be said for the Harrogates. A postgraduate researcher named Leah Chen recently reopened the sealed Harrogate collection. Among its items was a damaged hard drive recovered from my old university office. One file survived, a folder labeled Rosefield _test_final, containing 3,600 sequential images. She viewed them as a time-lapse. In the final second of playback, a blurred figure appears inches from the lens, eyes dark hollows, mouth stretched in the outline of a scream. The metadata lists the photographer as Reeves, Helen, though the system clock gives the date as 2 years after her recorded resignation. When Leah closed the file, her monitor stayed black for several minutes, reflecting only her own face. Until, behind her reflection, A doorway began to open.